Thank you, Karina. This is arguably the first time in my life that anyone suggested that passing something over to me was a fun matter. It is wonderful to see all of you here today. I see 168 participants, former politician that I am. I always look at those numbers to see how many people are signed in, and with good reason. Housing choices is arguably the most significant change in zoning in Massachusetts in several decades. It contains a lot of very important provisions, the provisions that people know about and have talked about throughout this effort, mainly revolve around the reduction of the 2/3 requirement to a majority requirement for a number of housing-related, housing-friendly decisions or zoning decisions, as well as certain permitting decisions. But there are also other things in regard to abutter appeals, in regard to multifamily zoning in MBTA communities, in regard to a number of items that were included in the package that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. And I know that all of us need to learn about the law, figure out what it says, incorporate it into our understanding, our broader understanding of 40A, and hopefully use it to generate some much needed housing and affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We all saw rent softening a bit, particularly in certain parts of the state during the pandemic, but I was just speaking with some members of my staff this morning who indicated they are beginning to trend up again in a number of locations. All the more important that we begin to address the supply issue, which is so crucial to the future of our economy in Massachusetts and the well-being of our residents. I want to thank some people for working very hard to prepare this webinar, which, by the way, is a first in a series of two. The second one will occur early in June, we hope. First of all, I want to thank on my own staff, my Chief of Housing and Neighborhood Development, Karina Oliver Milchman, who has already spoken, who spearheaded this effort. I want to thank on my staff also, Eric Hove, Elise Harmon, Christian Brandt, who all participated and helped to put this effort together and are on the screen today. And I also want to thank particularly from CHAPA, Laura Schufelt, I'm sorry, from MHP, Laura Schufelt, and also from CHAPA, Eric Schupin, for assisting in putting this together. I want to prospectively thank Bea Jimenez, who is the president of Abundant Housing, the board chair of Abundant Housing, and who is going to moderate our panel, and also to thank all of the panelists who you will meet shortly. For some introductory remarks, I'd like to introduce Secretary Michael Keneally from the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. That is his title, but over the course of the past 3 years, I would say he has actually been better known to his friends and maybe even his relatives as Mr. Housing Choices, who never tired of pushing this legislation, even during some dark days when it looked like it might not get anywhere. And I know we are lucky to have him. We would not have the law without his efforts. Secretary Keneally.
Hey, Mark, thank you for the really kind introduction and great to be with you all today. Big thanks to you and your team and Rachel and Eric at CHAPA and the team at MHP are what an incredible lineup of housing builders and advocates. And it's great to be with you all today. Of course, I'm delighted to have a discussion about the implementation of housing choice after years of discussion about how to get it done. And so this is a fun topic for us to get into. And of course, you know, your invitation to me today made me think back to the incredible coalition of folks we had working with us to get housing choice done. Your group and the MMA, real estate groups like NIOP and the Home Builders and the Greater Boston Real Estate Board, the Mass Association of Realtors, our incredible affordable housing advocates, CHAPA, MACDC, folks like the Boston Foundation and LISC. We had virtually every chamber of commerce in the state advocate for the law. They view this as an economic competitiveness issue. We had the AARP who viewed it as a senior housing issue. We built a big coalition of folks to help us get this done. And I'll always be grateful for the work of the people who joined us in that advocacy. We approach this work with a terrific sense of urgency, I think, as Mark alluded to. And I literally just walked in the door from a great event in Lowell to celebrate our small business grants. And the governor got a question about housing and went on and gave kind of an extended answer about our housing crisis. And that's what we've been calling it now for really since the start of the Baker-Polito administration, the housing crisis. And for us, you know, this starts with a basic lack of production of housing. And so you think about a 30-year period of time from 1960 to 1990, and then compare that to the next 30 years, we have cut in half our level of housing production in the Commonwealth, literally cut in half in a 30-year period of time. And so when you cut your production in half in a single generation and demand grows, what are you going to have? You're going to have rising prices. And that's what we've seen now across Massachusetts. We're number 3 in home values out of the 50 states. We've been number 1 in rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. The governor and I both like to joke about the fact we want to be number 1 in things. We're number 1 in life sciences. We're number 1 in lots of things. We don't want to be number 1 in rent. We have, about half of our households are cost burdened by housing. They're paying 30% or more of their income in housing. About a quarter of our renters are paying 50% or more. So this is a real problem. It's a real problem for our households, a real problem for our communities, a real problem for our ability to compete economically. And I was thinking back to, I'm sort of getting back on the road now that things are opening up a bit. I used to travel a lot as secretary, and I got thinking about our travels over the course of 2019, of which we did a lot, the governor, lieutenant governor, and myself. And we were in the middle of that point in time of developing our new economic development plan. And we did these 9 regional sessions around the state, did a lot of engagement with lots of stakeholders. And in every discussion, housing came up. And we heard everywhere we went that we're never going to have the kind of robust, inclusive economy we want unless we can build a lot more housing. And then, of course, we took the Housing Choice campaign on the road. We did 13 events around the state, literally from Williamstown to Provincetown, to build and demonstrate support for housing choice at the local level. And everywhere we heard there, community leaders said they need more tools. We had to change the game. We had to create conditions where they can build a lot more of the housing that works for them. And my other bit of travels around the state in 2019 was this affordable housing tour across Massachusetts that I did, organized by Kate Racer and the team at DHCD. It just a wonderful experience, something I'll never forget. We did 8 communities, 8 days, 17 communities, 28 developments. We were joined by about 1,000 people along the way. And we just saw the work up close. We saw these great affordable housing developments, housing for seniors and veterans and the homeless, great housing in downtowns and near public transit, the kind of developments we all want to have more of. And in fact, that was the message we got every step along the way on the tour was, we want to do more. Can you help us do more? And in our view, we are always prepared and still are to invest record amounts of money to create affordable housing through our programs at DHCD, the rental rounds, through our grant programs like MassWorks and many others, our programs through Mass Housing and MHP and CDAC and others. There's a lot of government resources dedicated to creating more affordable housing. But in our view, we had to free up the market. We really had to kind of change the game. And that's where Housing Choice came in, this targeted zoning reform, which for the first time in our state, going back 100 years, it's been state law, as you all know better than I do, that a rezoning of any property requires a 2/3 vote. And we thought if we could get that 2/3 down to a simple majority for a set of housing best practices, the types of housing developments I talked about, near public transit in downtowns, affordable multifamily housing. If we could do that, if we could make it easier to approve those projects at the local level, we think will unlock production of all kinds of housing across the state. And so that's what we're about now. And thankfully, a big thanks to our partners in the legislature for sharing the sense of urgency that we had to get this done. Took a few years, but here we are. The bill passed by the legislature in January and signed by the governor. And importantly, Housing Choice is effective. It was effective the day the governor signed it. And so January 15th, I think it was, effective on that day. And so from that day forward, any of those zoning votes for the types of projects covered by Housing Choice, there'll be people on this call far better equipped than I to get into the technical details. Those votes now require simple majority vote. And we're just tremendously excited that we finally reached that point in time where we have the ability to create to a different level, I think, the kind of housing we need across the state. It really is such an issue that touches on so much of our aspects of our communities, our economy, our society. I hear from businesses all the time, they need to attract talent and retain talent. Our high cost of housing is clearly an impediment to that. It really does impact the kind of communities we want to have. And I guess the other thing I'd add in terms of the moment we live in now today, and thinking back to the summer of 2020, when we all started to think about racial equity issues in probably a broader way than we had before. And when we saw the incredible impact of COVID-19, the disproportionate impact on communities of color. And there was a lot of studies done on trying to explain that. And housing became identified as a root cause issue, the fact that people are forced to live in crowded housing conditions. And so this is an equity issue as well. It's an issue of equity, opportunity, and stability in housing. And we look forward to seeing how this plays out in your cities and towns across the state, and looking at how this can finally address in a meaningful way, we believe, our housing crisis.
Thank you, Secretary. I'll turn it back over to Karina.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Secretary Keneally. I'm going to turn it over to Eric Hove, the co-director of strategic initiatives at MAPC, who's going to go over some key features and outstanding questions about housing choice. And then we're going to take some questions. So before I pass it to Eric, let me just provide a little bit of guidance on the Q&A. Please do add your questions to the chat. You can start doing that right away, and we'll go through and select a sample to respond to, time permitting. We're looking really for two kinds of questions. One, about the housing choice legislation in general, and two, about how it impacts specific initiatives. We're not looking for general comments on the legislation. We'll answer as many as possible today, and we'll share questions with DHCD. If you have a specific detailed question about a particular project, we might try to follow up with you offline. All right, Eric, please take it away.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you, Secretary Keneally. Really appreciate your leadership and your team's leadership on getting this across the finish line. It's been certainly a difficult and years-long fight. Definitely have the emotional scars to prove it. But like Mark said, housing choice is really the first major update to the zoning laws in a generation. And it does hold real promise in helping us to reach our goals, as the Secretary mentioned, on housing, climate, transportation, and racial and social equity. Related to this, MAPC has been updating our long-range regional plan, Metro Common 2050, where we've been looking at updating our regional goals, including racial equity, housing, and climate. And just right now, we're in the final stages of updating the plan with recommendations for how we reach these goals. And I'll note that we've already had to update some of our earlier draft recommendations because of the passage of legislation this session, like housing choice, or last session, and then this session with the next generation climate roadmap. But please do visit metrocommon.org to weigh in on the policies. I'm going to share my screen, pull up a little short presentation. And really, I'm going to provide, just kind of a brief overview of what's in the legislation. Start to outline some of the questions that we've been hearing from our communities and stakeholders about how the law can work, and implementation questions. And really want to hear today additional questions from all of you. I think housing choice, it's a very significant first step. There are a number of priorities that we couldn't get across the finish line in the past session that we'll continue to work with our allies on. Things like protecting renters, preventing displacement, and facilitating even more creation of affordable housing are all priorities that we still have a long way to go. But housing choice is a major first step forward, and really looking forward to turning into the implementation phase of that legislation. And that's really the focus for today. It's wonderful to see so many people here. I don't know if you love or hate zoning, or if you're just zoning curious, but happy to have you, and really looking forward to your questions and thoughts today. So let's jump into what's in the law. Like Mark and the Secretary said, really the heart of the law looks at reducing a number of housing measures for their adoption vote to a simple majority, down from a 2/3, to really help cities and towns be able to pass pro-housing ordinances and bylaws. One thing that the governor didn't originally include is that MBTA communities provision. I think that's actually surprised a lot of people, and obviously I think that's where many of the questions are focused on, is so much is going to be determined by the forthcoming guidance on how that provision will work. One thing I'll note in the governor's signing statement, he said while he didn't originally propose that provision, that he's signing it because he really feels like his administration has the ability to make this a workable program through the development of the guidance. But I'll jump into these. And again, I know there's been a number of webinars and resources out there, so I'm not going to get super in depth today. Really do want to hear, kind of your questions, and I'll have help from Mark Rassicott and Karina to try to answer what we can today, or pass along to the DHCD the ones that we don't have answers for. So again, really at the heart of it are ordinance and bylaw provisions that could now be adopted by simple majority as opposed to the 2/3 majority. These include by right multifamily housing and mixed use development in eligible locations, and we'll talk about eligible locations in a second. Also by right accessory dwelling units, whether within a home or a detached structure, and also open space residential development by right. 40R districts also would now be adopted by a simple majority, as would transfer development rights or natural resource protection bylaws, as long as there's no overall net reduction in the yield that could be produced through those measures. And then this last one is really a catch-all, really any modifications to dimensional regs, as long as it can be demonstrated that additional housing will result. Also, changes in terms of bylaws that could be adopted in ordinances that allow by special permit. Again, multifamily housing or mixed use development by special permit in eligible smart growth locations, increases in permissible density or population, accessory dwelling units in a detached structure. And finally, there's a provision that would allow a reduction in the amount of parking required for residential or mixed use development. And again, these are all by special permit changes. And then a third major section looks at modifying the vote quantums for actual special permits. So this is when a development comes before a planning board or whoever that special permit granting authority is within a city or town. But the ones that would apply here, again, are multifamily districts within a half mile of a transit station, so long as there's at least 10% of the units that would be deed restricted affordable to 80% of AMI, area median income. Another one focuses on mixed use developments in centers of commercial activity, again, with that 10% affordability threshold included. And lastly, any special permit to reduce parking ratios, again, if it can be demonstrated that additional units could be created. Then we get to the MBTA communities. This law really affects over half of our cities and towns, really primarily in Eastern Massachusetts. Those cities, I believe there's 176 that are defined by the statute. And this requires at least one district of reasonable size for multifamily housing without age restrictions and suitable for families with children. There's a gross density requirement of at least 15 units per acre, subject to any further state level limitations through wetlands or septic regulations. And these districts should be located within a half mile of a transit station, if applicable. And really, I think that if applicable applies to the communities that are considered MBTA communities, but don't actually have a bus or train or commuter rail stop. They still are subject to this provision. And I think that's one of the questions we have in terms of where that type of district and what that district could look like in towns that don't have a transit station. Excuse me. If a municipality does not comply, really the incentive for complying, I guess put in another way, is being eligible for 3 of the state's grant programs. Obviously, MassWorks is the largest state grant infrastructure program. DHCD has already issued guidance saying that for this upcoming grant round, that all communities are considered in compliance with this provision until a future date when they come out with guidance that gets more in details in terms of what compliance expectations are. A couple other provisions that are also included in housing choice is changes to protesting or zoning protest. It's just making that process more difficult to be able to protest a zoning proposal. It increases the % of owners that would have to sign up the petition, as well as lowering the previous vote to be able to adopt a zoning proposal. Abutter appeals. This provides a judge with the discretion to require appellants to a site plan, special permit, or variance decision to post a bond up to $50,000. There is language in there that directs the judge to consider the relative merits of the appeal and also balance the relative financial means between the plaintiff and defendant. There's a procedure for special permit parking reductions. In order to do this, the special permit granting authority would have to make a finding that the public good would be served by such a reduction, and there would not be a substantial adverse effect to the neighborhood because of that reduction in parking. And then finally, the last kind of piece in here, as a regional planning agency, we obviously like this, but basically provides contiguous municipalities to better and closer coordinate on development issues. DHCD has been issuing guidance, including FAQs. The most recent has been updated April 9th. Definitely direct people with questions to check that out. A few things I wanted to mention here today that I think are coming up a lot from questions we're getting from our city and town partners. One is determining the voting threshold. And in the legislation, it does not actually say, it doesn't specify whose responsibility it is to determine this. So what the guidance is saying basically is, A, be as clear as possible what you believe that zoning threshold is. The planning board should be talking to municipal council in terms of why you think whatever the 2/3 or simple majority standard should apply, and include that recommendation in the report to town meeting or to city council. The second one is causing, I'd say, a lot of vexation. It's the language in the law that says you cannot combine zoning provisions that have different vote quantums. So for example, if you have a multifamily proposal, but also combining that with, say, a commercial or industrial proposal that would require a 2/3, that you really can't combine those and expect to pass it and be able to pass it by a simple majority. So DHCD has issued some guidance on this. It's definitely a confusing issue. I know some towns have already been struggling with it in spring town meeting. One example, the first one we heard about was the town of Needham. They actually decided to split the zoning up. So they considered the changes to commercial uses, and that actually passed overwhelmingly with the 2/3, and they're going to go back with the housing provision in the fall is how they're doing that. So I think the tricky thing here especially is that there needs to be a guarantee that multifamily housing will pass. So just saying that it's one of a number of different uses is not enough to qualify for that simple majority. It needs to basically be a guarantee. So that's one that we're struggling with, but we hope we'll continue to clarify over time. And then the determining eligible locations, again, it's not specified whose responsibility this is, but eligible locations are defined in the statute. There's even more detail in the Chapter 40R regulations that DHCD advises cities and towns to take a look at. And again, similar to the voting threshold, the proponent and planning board, should talk to their municipal council in terms of what they think, if they think it's qualifies as an eligible location. And if you do have questions, you can seek an advisory opinion from DHCD. I think they expect to be able to offer that within a 30-day turnaround. One other thing that we've heard that I wanted to mention before moving off this slide is the question of updates to zoning, and whether if you're updating an existing bylaw that would otherwise qualify for the simple majority, can you do that by simple, or is that still required to do by 2/3? It is our understanding that if it qualifies, regardless if it's a brand new bylaw or an update to an existing, as long as it meets the criteria in the law that you can make that update by a simple majority. And then closing up the presentation is focusing on the MBTA communities. This is where we have many questions that we really hope will be clarified through the guidance. I think we have a lot of promise with this provision, and right now the administration is developing guidance and the times for compliance. They have said that they will have a extensive stakeholder process, and really including cities and towns, making sure that people's thoughts and concerns are heard as part of that development process. And it sounds like we'll have more information on the timeline in the next few weeks. Like I said earlier, I think there is great promise in this provision, but it is very dependent on really how the guidance shakes out in the end. And we as MAPC certainly believe that the MBTA communities provision has the potential and really can be effective, fairly applied, and reasonable to implement. These are some of the questions that are cropping up, from our conversations across our region. It says you have to have a district of reasonable size, but that's really all it says, other than the gross density thresholds. So that kind of asks us, is there a minimum size geographically of these districts, or a certain yield? It will be based on a percentage of existing units. So I think a lot of questions there in terms of what that reasonable size is. It also requires the districts to be suitable for families with children. That's again all it says in the statute. So looking for guidance on that. Is 3-bedroom units at 10% sufficient to meet that standard? I think those are questions that we're definitely hearing about. And then any parameters or differences for municipalities that don't have stations in terms of location or what those districts can look like. Also have heard from towns without sewer, especially that could be a real constraint on developing sizable districts, and hearing questions like, could there be a priority under the MassWorks program for helping support the development or infrastructure needs of these new districts? Final slide on some of the questions we're hearing is, right now it's silent. The statute is silent on any affordable or inclusionary zoning requirements in the district. We certainly are encouraging, communities to build in affordability. And I think in some locations, we're concerned that new districts, new zoning could have displacement pressures for existing people that live in or near those districts. So what kind of techniques or strategies can communities apply to make sure that there are affordable opportunities and also limits on some of the potential displacement pressures? Similarly, it doesn't contemplate mixed use in the district. These locations generally are prime candidates for mixed use. It's our hope that the guidance allows mixed use as long as you're meeting the other density and other thresholds for the multifamily component there. Another question that we have is, will the criteria vary depending on the differences in local circumstances? Some places have frequent, high, reliable transportation. Others are very occasional. Some towns have gone a long way and already building affordable units and are high on the subsidized housing inventory, while others lag further behind. So we're really curious about any kind of differences between either the service or actions that have already been taken by a municipality. We have heard from the administrations, they understand that it takes time to plan and zone for these districts. So we're definitely optimistic that they'll build into this as part of their guidance, that it is a process to rezone these areas. So I'm looking for some reasonable times in terms of coming into compliance. And finally, as a regional planning agency, this is probably a rhetorical question for us, but what data and tools can streamline the planning and approval process? We certainly would love to work with the administration on figuring, what can we do to help our cities and towns achieve compliance as easily as possible. So that's what I have on the slides. Really looking forward to hearing what else is on your mind. And I'm going to be joined by Karina and Mark Rassicott for the next segment here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So before we segue from our questions to some of your questions, I just want to give Secretary Keneally another opportunity to comment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I've got to hop to another meeting, but that was a great presentation. Just two quick comments. One is on the MBTA communities, that is a very new concept for us. It's going to require a process of a lot of thinking, a lot of engagement. We've got a team within the administration working on it now, including MHP. We're going to have a robust stakeholder engagement process, including MAPC and CHAPA. I may be telling them now for the first time, but thank you guys in advance for helping out. But we got to put a lot of thought into this one and make sure we get it right and do it in a way that it's consistent with the intent of the law, but also recognize there's a lot of communities involved in this, and we got to have something that isn't one size fits all. The second point I want to make is that our office is very much open for any questions you may have on this. We will endeavor to make our guidance back to you quick and simple and consistent with the intent of this law, which is to build more housing. But we recognize it's new territory for all of us. So please let us know any questions you may have, and very much looking forward to seeing how this gets implemented in your communities. Great to be with you all. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Secretary. And thank you to Eric for the presentation. So we're joined today by a couple of other staff people in case we get a real humdinger and we need a few people to weigh in here. We have Mark Rassicat, Director of Land Use, myself, Eric Hove. We might call on Eric Shupin from CHAPA and some others if needed. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and Christian Brandt in our community engagement department is going to facilitate this. So thank you, Christian. And just one real quick comment. I've been told by a couple of people that they're having trouble hearing me. I've been told by a couple other people that I'm loud and clear. I'm not sure what's going on there, but please bear with me.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for your questions. We've got some great ones, so I'll just get us started with a question from Heather Hoffman. Does the law require that a zoning change increase density of housing? For example, could a petition reduce density as long as it allows for multifamily dwellings?
Anyone can jump in here. Eric, do you want to take the first stab?
I'm not sure I actually have an answer for that one. I'm thinking about it.
Well, so I would have some follow-up questions on that question. If multifamily is already allowed and you're considering a reduction of density, is that an amendment to the existing bylaw and ordinance? Or is it a new bylaw or ordinance? So that would probably be a factor in determining the voting threshold. So I think that's the first thing that occurs to me. Because there, as Eric noted in his presentation, there is some question about whether amendments or only new zoning is eligible. That's a question that we also have in the chat from Francis Goyes at Mass Housing. Francis, now you know that we are not clear on the answer just yet. All right.
Great. Unless anyone else has insights onto that, I can move on to the next question. All right, so we got a couple questions about ADUs and ADU ordinances. And so the first one was a concern about an ADU ordinance that strays from the definition in the state's description. And so the question is, what can we do in the future to stress the adherence to the descriptions that the state has in the legislation so that it gets to the 50% threshold?
Well, I will try that one. I think that if a municipality wants to qualify for the 50% threshold, they should follow the definition that is in the state law. And they should know that if they put additional restrictions on it, that may be making it subject to a 2/3 vote instead of a 50% vote. But obviously it's up to the municipality to propose the type of ordinance or bylaw that they want. They just need to realize the repercussions of it.
I think some of us were caught a little unawares this Springtown meeting season, but hopefully with more lead time going forward, we can be very diligent about drafting zoning in an intentional way to be eligible for the simple majority threshold. I think that technical assistance providers like MAPC, private consultants, MHP can all help our communities be intentional in that way and check draft zoning for eligibility and provide recommendations for what kind of edits to the language may be needed.
Great. And a related question is, does this apply to ADU by right warrants before a town meeting?
I don't want to hog it, but yes, assuming that the other requirements were in place, the other protocol needed to be eligible, certainly by right, ADUs would qualify.
Awesome.
Anyone else, feel free to chime in if I'm off base or have only a partial answer, please.
I think unless I'm missing something, and Eric or Mark or Karina could clarify this, I think the simple majority is for ADU warrants that are by right. I think it does not apply if you are passing an ADU warrant that would then subsequently require a special permit vote. Am I correct about that, or am I don't want to mislead here. You're muted, Mark.
Probably just as well, Mark. I think you are correct, but I would need to double check.
All right, so I'm going to move us on to the next question, and that is, how can we require that 10% of the units created are deed restricted affordable units which qualify for the SHI and count towards our HPP annual production goals?
So this is Eric Shupin. I'm from CHAPA, and I can comment on the affordability question. And there have been a couple questions about that affordable housing component. For housing choice, whether you're enacting zoning bylaws to create these multifamily districts, there's not a requirement that that multifamily district have an affordable housing component. There are other portions of the law that, as Eric Hove went through, that would approving a special permit for certain development around public transportation or mixed use development, that there is an affordable component. So taking up that kind of special permit, that would guarantee that there would be at least 10% that's affordable. If you're just creating a multifamily district, we're looking at this as an opportunity to be able to create that kind of affordable housing by using all the tools at your disposal, including whether your community has an inclusionary zoning bylaw. If it does, and there's housing that's built in these multifamily districts with it, well, then we know that a certain amount of it is going to be affordable. There are also local funds or even state funds that can go into the kinds of developments that are built in those districts that would make it deed restricted and affordable. So all of that we see as ways to get to more affordable housing through using housing choice. Now, getting to the question of how does it qualify for the SHI, and the SHI is the subsidized housing inventory. That's the count of affordable housing to determine 40B counts, and the HPP, the housing production plans, the annual production goals. In order to qualify for the subsidized housing inventory, the housing that's built in those districts would have to meet all of the requirements of what would normally qualify for the SHI, including long-term deed restricted unit. And so, would have to have those components as well to count towards the SHI.
Okay, thank you, Eric. All right, moving on to our next question. Would this new bylaw make it easier to divide a large residential house into 3 or 4 individual dwelling units?
I think the answer is yes to that. Basically, it looks at any provisions that would produce a yield in new units, more housing. So if there was a bylaw that would allow for the creation of additional units within an existing dwelling, then that would apply under simple majority.
Okay, thank you, Eric. So we have a couple of questions all about the MBTA communities component of this. And the first one is, if you are part of an MBTA community but have no rail, subway, ferry terminal, or bus station, can you pick anywhere for the district you must create to go?
I think that's one of the issues that needs to be provided guidance on from DHCD.
But I also think that there are certainly strong hints that these multifamily districts should be in one of the smart growth locations that is defined under 40R, even though 40R is not specifically used in the legislation. It is referred to in the guidance. So, as I've said before to many people, you wouldn't want to put this on Aunt Martha's farm down by the river in the endangered species habitat that's over your aquifer protection zone. You'd probably want to have it in a village center.
Great, thanks, Mark. And then related to the MBTA communities component, will bus stops be considered bus stations for purposes of this legislation?
I'm gonna have to take a look at that, but I think I can answer quickly on that one.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and then we have to move on. So other than the specific change in section 9 regarding the 3 cases where it is now simple majority and the MBTA community piece, aren't the rest of these changes something a body could choose to enact but don't have to do anything if they choose not to?
Yeah, it's my understanding, like really everything in this except for the MBTA communities is it's up to the community whether there's going to be an attempt to update zoning or change special permits. I mean, I guess if there is a special permit proposal that comes in that would qualify, it will automatically change the vote if it's eligible. But there's nothing in here that requires a community to change their zoning. It really just changes the votes, again, with the one exception of the MBTA communities provision.
I would like to emphasize that a little bit more if I could. There's often been a lot of question about whether or not this is really local option or not. And it is local option in the sense that other than the MBTA requirement, the community does not need to do any of these things, does not need to adopt any of this zoning at all, regardless of the voting threshold that's used. However, if you are choosing to go forward with a zoning change that complies under the list provided in the Housing Choices Law, and it is therefore a simple majority vote, then it will have to be a simple majority vote in your community. You don't get the authority to decide on your own once you put something forward, whether it's going to be simple majority or 2/3. That's determined by the statute. And I might note that appears to apply even if your community has an ordinance or bylaw that repeats, that sort of restates the 2/3 requirement of state law. We are encouraging communities to adjust their own ordinances and bylaws to comply with the Massachusetts statute. But if you happen to have something in your bylaws that says everything's by 2/3, and then a zoning proposal comes up, which would be simple majority under Housing Choices, it's simple majority because the state law obviously trumps the local ordinance or bylaw.
Great, thank you, Mark. I am going to turn it back to Karina so that we can continue on with our session today. But thank you, everybody, for your questions. And we're looking forward to another lively discussion.
Christian, and thank you all for some really great questions. We will be reviewing the ones that we didn't get to after the webinar today, and we'll follow up as needed and be sure to pass anything on that we can't answer to those who may be able to, including DHCD. If not right now, then down the line. So we're going to segue to our panel discussion, and we're going to hear from municipalities across Massachusetts that have successfully passed zoning that's now eligible for simple majority thanks to Housing Choice, but they did it back when they had to reach a 2/3 threshold. And they'll talk to us about why and how they rezoned and the benefits of doing so, hopefully with Housing Choice having lowered one of the major barriers to these kinds of efforts, other other communities like yourselves will be able to follow suit. So once again, please put your questions for the panelists in the chat and we'll take some after the discussion. Now I'm going to turn it over to Beasmin Jimenez to introduce our panel and moderate the discussion. Thank you, Bea.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you everyone for this conversation. Hi, everyone. My name is Bea Jimenez. I use the she series pronouns, and I'm the president of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. We are a new statewide pro-housing organization that is working to organize housing advocates around the state, actually to make sure that we can realize the full benefit of housing choice and other pro-housing policies across the state. I am so excited to be here with people who certainly already put their gloves on, ready for a fight and ready to make sure that housing was an accessible right in their communities. So I'm excited to share in community with you all. I think I'll give each panelist at least a minute to introduce themselves and share a little bit about their work in their community. So Jean, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm Jean Delios from the town of Reading. I've been in municipal government for many years. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on the invite program, so good to see everybody. Yeah, in Reading, we have been working for over 10 years on some pretty aggressive zoning changes. We were successful on attempting and getting them passed under the old rules. So that was hard work, but work that we're really glad we were able to do. And the downtown smart growth district in Reading is a 40R district. We started in 2009 with a small subset, and then we expanded it in 2017 to include the whole downtown. And then the bonus to that geography is that we have an MBTA commuter rail station in the downtown. So it was a natural progression to go with the 40R zoning, to do all the things we're trying to do to keep downtown vital and to preserve what we have and to promote growth in a managed and sustainable way. So we're very pleased, and we've had a lot of exciting projects as a result of that zoning change. And I'm happy to talk more about it as people are interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That's fantastic. And I'm excited to hear more about, what was the tipping point in your community and how you got things done. I'll turn it over to Carolyn. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi, sorry about that little fumble there. Carolyn Mish with the city of Northampton. We're a small city way west of Boston, about 28,000 people. I've been with the city about 20 years, and over that time, we've been working a lot on readdressing the zoning changes and development patterns that had taken place in the 70s and 80s. But most probably dramatically working on zoning changes since our adoption of a Sustainable Northampton Plan in 2012 and 13. We really started a concerted effort to try to generate housing that that would reflect the historic neighborhood patterns that are so important for the city of Northampton and are so valued by residents and visitors alike. So we were trying to match those historic densities and eliminate nonconformities that the zoning in the 70s, 80s, and 90s had created. And more recently, we've worked on sort of a four-pronged approach to try to address our housing needs and the gaps that we found, and in particular evolving from ADU by right into a full two-family by right throughout the city, as well as creating incentives for smaller units. So we have created this half-scale residential incentive, so I can talk a little bit about those. But basically the idea is to address both subsidized housing needs as well as market rate housing needs in all sizes, types, shapes, and to address different needs of the different demographics in our community.
I love that. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And Northampton is small but mighty, so I appreciate that. Kristen, hi, Kristen, joining us from Acton.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be a part of this. So yes, I'm from Acton. It's about a community of 23,000 people. We have town meeting form of government. So for those of you out there working with town meeting form of government, you know it can be tough to pass some of these regulations. Acton has benefited from having some very small, but some multifamily zoning districts by right for quite a while, but they're small, mostly built out. And so over the past 10 years, you know, we've been really working to achieve a lot of the goals in the master plan on housing diversity and pursuing mixed use zoning, which we've had some failures, but we've also had a lot of really great wins with accessory dwelling units and moving that forward a few years at a time, which I can speak more about. Acton also took part in CHAPA's municipal engagement initiative as part of the pilot program. And I think that it's really helped to move the dialogue forward on housing. And I think there's actually a group member here today. So hopefully we'll hear from him.
We have some special friends maybe joining us. Thank you so much, Kristen. And last but certainly not least, I have Alex joining us.
Great, thanks so much. My name is Alex Train. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development with the City of Chelsea. As many of you know, Chelsea is a densely settled environmental justice community situated north of Boston. We have a population of approximately 50 to 60,000 residents, and we are a sort of hub for regional economic activity. The city's been championing a multifaceted housing strategy comprising of acquisition, rehabilitation, preservation, and then housing production with a focus on transit-oriented development, sustainable building materials, and resilient, healthy homes that are accessible to families in Chelsea. So over the course of the last 10 years, you know, we've established two 40R districts, starting with the Box District, which is located adjacent to the Silver Line Gateway service in Chelsea Greenway. We remediated a former brownfield to create about 248 affordable units. And now fast forwarding to the sort of 2021-2022 period, we're spearheading a public-private partnership with the Chelsea Housing Authority and the Joseph J. Corcoran Company to redevelop 96 units of substandard public housing into 330 units of transit accessible mixed income housing with integrative services, including childcare and healthcare, located right next to the Silver Line. This was a project that was significantly supported by the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development with a MassWorks grant and direct capital investments. So we see this as one of the more innovative models we're seeking to replicate across the city as we modernize our public housing, which is really, truly affordable for our families in the community. So looking forward to being here.
Thank you so much, Alex. And it sounds like you're leading important work in Chelsea. So thank you for your advocacy there. So moving into our conversation, I think, Jean, I'll come back to you because I know you're a veteran in this space and you've been really working hard to shake things up. One of the questions that we had for you was thinking about your 40R rezoning and what motivated you to undertake this task, and what kind of narrative maybe helped you sell this ADU zoning that you also were able to accomplish. Can you share with us more?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, the basically what was happening in Reading, which I know happens in a lot of other places, is some of the properties were turning over. Some key parcels the town was aware were going to be turning over, were going to be going to the market, had some preliminary work about redevelopment. And under the current zoning way back 12 years ago, these projects wouldn't be allowed. We had a downtown that was zoned as business and did not allow for residential. Now, granted, nuances of zoning. Before zoning, people put houses in, and so there was residential use in the downtown, but it was not allowed under zoning. So that's where the impetus came in to say, we should really be looking at a way to rezone specifically for the two projects, one in particular, but then there was a second one that came along that we knew were going to need some relief on zoning. So that's what started it. And so when we passed the zoning in 2009, it was very hard. It was a real challenge because we actually had one town meeting member stand up and make a PowerPoint presentation on why town meeting should not pass it. So we had a lot of opposition. And ultimately, we prevailed. There were some twists and turns along the way to figure out a way to find some middle ground. And so we were able to do that before the town meeting and then work with the people who had the concerns. And then it passed. And so we had one project that used the zoning. The other project ended up not using that zoning, going with something a little bit different, but the zoning was available. Having those two property owners at town meeting was one of the keys to our success. So we had projects ready and we had property owners attend and say, but for this zoning, they couldn't do mixed use. They couldn't do a residential component. Now, ultimately, as I say, one of the property owners changed their decision to go with residential for a variety of reasons. But at the time, that's what was happening, these two projects. So that was probably the main key. That and having a robust public outreach program were probably the two big things that helped us be successful. And then fast forward, we lived through that dire time when the market was, the economy was bad. And so we didn't get much more except for those couple of projects. And then in 2017, things obviously were a lot better in the economy. And we understood there was at least one more, maybe two more projects. But again, they were outside of that district. And by expanding it, we knew we would be able to, again, accommodate these other projects that needed a zoning change. So when we rezoned the whole downtown, that one actually was a lot easier, the second bite of it. And so doing it in a couple of bites for us ended up being a good strategy. And so where we are right now is we've had 4 40R mixed use developments, about 200 units of housing, and about 10,000 square feet of first floor commercial. And for those of you who don't know Reading, Reading is, you know, your typical suburban 25,000 population community. As I say, the biggest thing we have going for us in terms of promoting walkable communities and affordable housing and smart growth is a downtown smart growth district. So having that transportation component, having the MBTA, we have bus as well, but the commuter rail station as a hub for public transportation was another winning piece of this strategy. So I'll stop there on 40R. I could go on forever.
No, Jean, this is fantastic. And I think you have the audience here who would be more than willing to listen about some of your successes. I'll shift it over to Carolyn because something that you said, Jean, reminded me of our conversation. And Carolyn, I know that you are finding ways to be even more creative and using your regional bus lines and finding ways to advocate for the use of more development across those bus lines. I know an interesting story that you shared with us is taking your counselors on a bus ride to show them what the zoning relief would do. Yeah. Sometimes it's better just to show and tell, and that's great. So can you share more about some of the work that you've been leading in Northampton?
Sure. So, well, I'll start out with the older story about the bus tour. But that was going back to sort of 2013, we really were, there were some concerns by our city councilors about the potential influx of new housing that might dramatically change neighborhoods. And what we were trying to just encourage people to think about is the fact that we couldn't recreate the same housing that everybody loved in those neighborhoods under the previous zoning, and that modifications to the zoning would allow some additional units, but would really just sort of reflect the densities in the neighborhood. So we picked out a few parcels in which they were considered non-conforming, and how you could create new lots by carving off some additional lots next to these, and sort of created a bus tour to take the counselors to say, this is what we're talking about. This 3-family couldn't be replicated on this other parcel right next door to it, but you can see that there's plenty of room to do that. So that really brought it home to see that it wasn't sort of, we weren't trying to promote these monstrous, 1,000-unit developments in the neighborhoods. And more recently, when we've just adopted amendments that essentially are the next evolution of change from our ADUs, and really converting those to 2 families and allowing 2 families across the city. The idea was really to say, look, this is both a housing attainability issue as well as an equity issue for people, that not everyone needs a full or large single family home. We've been successful in these developing these accessory dwelling units, but there's still some barriers because of the cap on the total size of an accessory dwelling unit, and also the requirements that we had in Northampton for home ownership of one of the units. So transitioning from accessory dwelling units to 2-family by right throughout the city was really, we presented it as being creating a level playing field for anyone who might feel like, for whatever reasons, they want to add another unit in their home, either from family or economic changes, or if they just are able to provide additional housing options for people who might not otherwise be able to live in that neighborhood because of the restrictions on 2-family. So that's one piece. The other piece on the 2 sort of 2-for-1 housing incentives for smaller units is sort of our version of micro units for a small community. So our half-scale unit zoning that was adopted was really well received by, it passed unanimously by council, because we knew we had this demand for smaller units. And no one seemed to bat an eye that, even though we were saying you could get 2 units in the same space that normally just a single family would be allowed, or 8 units where you would normally have a 4-unit, it just seemed to make sense to people. And there was no pushback at all. And it was really about saying, look, some people just need smaller housing, and the market is not doing it by itself, because there wasn't any other kind of incentive for that. So that was a benefit for us, that people felt like it was a good thing to do.
And a benefit for all of your residents who are now able to enjoy that community even more now.
Yeah.
And I do love what you said, Carolyn, and so I'll pick up on that housing isn't a racial justice and equity issue. So I'll come to Alex, who I know is doing a lot of work in Chelsea to combat and address displacement. So Alex, I'd love to hear from you. How do you see Housing Choice helping or hurting the effort that you're leading in combating displacement?
That's a great question. So I think we see sort of both sides of the issue, where the housing choice legislation can both be a way to kind of stem the tide of displacement, but if improperly executed, it could also accelerate displacement. So in communities like Chelsea and other gateway cities, housing choice unlocks a really incredible and unprecedented opportunity to create multifamily residential within walking distance of public transit. In a place like Chelsea, where over 30% of our households are transit dependent, we see that as a sort of win for transit and environmental justice. But on the other side of the coin, this notion that by creating housing with an affordable component, sort of at 80% area median income, is sort of doing our part and addressing the affordability issue, sort of isn't an argument that really holds water in a place like Chelsea. Many of our households almost exclusively, live at incomes that are at or below 50% of the area median income. And much of the affordable housing that's produced can oftentimes be out of reach for those families. So, we see sort of this as a chance that we can take to seriously sort of get down to business on production, as long as we're producing the types of housing and the affordability mixes that are responsive to our community needs.
I love that. Thank you so much, Alex. Kristen, don't think I forgot about you. I know that you've worked with our partners at CHAPA with their municipal engagement initiative. And I remember you sharing some of the lessons learned from that time and how it really helped you and your team reframe the issue of housing in Acton. Can you share more with us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to, because this was something that came to us from CHAPA at a time where we were feeling pretty down and out about losing a zoning change for mixed use. CHAPA had approached us in the planning department, the previous planning director, and myself, and asked if we'd be interested in moving it forward in Acton. And we definitely were teetering on that, advocacy planner piece. When you're in a municipality, we tried to move it forward quickly to residents, but it was great to be a part of it in the beginning. But what I can say, I think the most exciting part about it was that it was really like building a coalition of people that were engaged and invested in housing issues, and ranging from housing diversity in size, in type, for different people that have disabilities or children that will age out of the turning 22 kind of groups. So there's a lot of different people involved in that group. And, we started it again, like I said, after we kind of lost a big zoning initiative, but pulling everyone together and looking at what we could tackle next was helpful. And we looked at trying to relax some of the zoning regulations for accessory dwelling units. And, Acton's had accessory dwelling units since the 70s, tried to relax them in the 90s, and then again in 2016. And then in 2019, we had this new citizens group that formed as a response of that CHAPA engagement initiative, and they're called Housing for All. I'm not sure if Bob is still on here, but I saw Bob Van Meter, he was on here before, he's on that group. And this group really allowed for us to have a community ambassadors who were people in the community that had connections from different groups. We had religious leaders, we had members of nonprofits, we had realtors, and they really pulled together support for passing an accessory dwelling unit by right, detached, and also additions, just connecting to housing to the main dwelling unit as well. And they worked to spread the word about the article. They made sure that their message was the same, that it was consistent. And they were able to go to people and go to the groups like the COA and go to people that had their trust, that may not have been necessarily involved in town government before. And I think that was really helpful to move that initiative forward. The other piece that I think we all learned was that you have to get to the microphone first, both at the zoning public hearing and at town meeting. And they made sure to do that. I think they found that it's much harder to speak negatively about housing after someone has just stated all of the benefits that it can bring to a community, especially in regards to equity and diversity. So, kudos to that group. And, we're very lucky and fortunate to have them here in Acton.
That's fantastic. I love that story. I love when you share that story. Thank you so much. And I love the idea of getting to the mic first. I have a question that any of our panelists can feel free to take up. But, giving our conversation today around housing choice and its need for implementation and how this will help support more rezoning efforts and hopefully lead to more housing production, what may you share to our audience today about some of the key lessons that you've learned? And now that housing choice has passed and hopefully remove some of the barriers, how do you see this working in your community? And maybe you can even share what you've seen as some of the benefits, even through the strong opposition that you saw to some of those projects. I see you all with your thinking faces. Okay, Kristen.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to an initiative that we lost, that mixed use zoning initiative, and it lost by 16 votes. So, you know, knowing the outreach that was done back then, and that we didn't have this housing for all group at that time, I think that initiatives like that, you know, that are supported in the town's master plan, in the town's housing production plan, I think that they'll be more successful. And once the community is ready to kind of tackle that again, you know, I look forward to that and to using those tactics that we've learned with the accessory dwelling bylaw.
Thank you, Kristen. Any other comments from our panelists? We're going to be getting to Q&A from the audience, but I just want to make sure that everyone can weigh in on this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd like to say, I think that some, from our perspective, sometimes there's, you know, the fear that some of these zoning changes will really have a negative impact on existing neighborhoods. And so the, even after the fact, if some people are discontent with some of the changes, there may be initiatives to try to pull back the zoning that was adopted. So I think having that lower threshold now could benefit from those efforts from people who are still sort of carry those fears, even though they may not have been entirely realized or what have you. But I think the other piece, so I think the adoption piece is beneficial. I think in terms of the board approval process and the reduction in to a simple majority is beneficial for certainly for the projects that have the affordable housing component. But you know, it places smaller communities, and certainly it's I think the factor out here in Western Mass is that most of our affordable housing is being developed by nonprofits. And so we don't have an inclusionary housing, the capacity to require inclusionary housing, which makes it, it means that not every project that is going to be include housing will have an affordable housing component, but yet the housing is still greatly needed. And so it might not benefit some communities to have that 10% requirement. But another tool that maybe communities could use is reducing the requirements for special permit for some of these projects. So that is another way of getting at the simple majority vote instead of the 2/3 majority vote. And that way projects could get through even if there weren't an affordable housing component.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to shift to some questions from the audience. So thank you everyone for being engaged in this conversation today. And thank you, of course, to our panelists for all the great work that you're leading. This is a question that I believe is framed around development fiscal impacts. The question is, what is the financial advantages or disadvantages to a community to have these rezoning changes, if any? If anyone wants to take that up.
I can talk about that for a minute. You know, another added benefit that we expected from the redevelopment of these underutilized sites was economic development. And so we kept saying all along, housing is economic development. And for a lot of people, that was a novel concept. So we really pushed that message out, and having the mixed use was something we were also very interested in. Under 40R, it can be either all residential or mixed use, which was how we got there. But having mixed use and having that commercial first floor component really adds, in our case, to so much of what we were trying to accomplish with keeping downtown vital. So the big picture for Reading was we decided where the development was going to be okay. And collectively as a community, we decided in the downtown next to the commuter rail station, increasing the density and going with mixed use was going to be okay for the town. Not everybody, but that was sort of a community goal that was embraced. And then from there, we just moved forward.
I want to sort of take it in a sort of look at it in a different way, not just financial, fiscally, sort of fiscal outcomes, but from a sustainable and sustainable outcome and reduction in carbon footprints. We're trying to encourage housing that's more walkable and bikeable to our community centers and create opportunities for people to reduce some of their trips, which then ultimately does have a physical component to our communities and also health benefits and health outcomes. And so that's a key factor for us, is tying and the same as in Reading, when you've got housing that's close to transit, you're reducing those stressors and needs for addressing street improvements and air quality benefits you get from people who aren't always hopping into their car for every trip they're taking.
Thank you so much both for answering that question. I have a few more, but Alex, did you want to weigh in? I wasn't sure if I was getting a signal from you before I move on.
Yeah, just real quick. So the only comment I would add would be sort of, we've been approaching the kind of topic of housing production and preservation in concert with our workforce development initiatives. So we've begun to integrate workforce training, reskilling, and partnerships with both building trades and local nonprofit workforce development agencies into both vertical construction projects as well as public infrastructure projects. So it provides a fertile ground for job training, provides employment opportunities, and those are sort of economic impacts that go on to have large multiplier effects in the community while still having social benefits as well.
I love that. Thank you so much, Alex. A few more questions are pouring in, so I'm going to do my best to read this out loud. A question from our audience: what are the best resources available for model bylaws that communities can utilize to implement some of the successful initiatives that we've discussed today? I'm actually thinking maybe Laura from MHP might be good to answer this.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Bea.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but I figured you'd be the expert.
Yeah, I really think that probably the best source of model bylaws is your regional planning agencies. I think MAPC and the others across the state. Or if you have a neighbor community whose bylaw you like, that's always a good source. And MHP Community Assistance, where I work, does keep track of bylaws across the state as we see them, and can suggest communities that may have something that is similar to what the community is looking for.
I love that. Thank you so much, Lauren. Thanks for jumping in. I appreciate
You're
that.
welcome.
There's been some great resources in the chat that the team at MAPC has shared, so please feel free to make use of that as well. I think we have time for one more question. So I'll continue with these audience questions that have been rolling in. Again, thank you so much to our audience for being very, very engaged today. I'm just digging through. I have a question here. Any of our panelists can feel free to take it on. For the communities who have had zoning wins, were these done to work towards your 10% SHI mandate, or were they tools in maintaining it, or both?
At least on our end, we are, I don't know, I think we're at like 20% or 19% now. We've kind of stopped being concerned with the production side from that lens. But for communities that have below 10% and might be subject to unfriendly 40B projects, this is an excellent tool to produce enough housing to get you over that 10% threshold.
And to add that, in Acton, the initiatives that we were moving forward, both the one that wasn't so successful, but then the ADUs, neither of them were about meeting the 10%. It was about meeting the goals of the community. Acton at the time was under 10%. Now we're over. There are, I think, residents that are very focused in on that number, but we try to talk about that once you hit that number, you're not done. It doesn't really meet the goals. 10% is just a number that was set to try to overcome some of the injustices of the past, but and that still exists today. But I think that it's important to always go back to your housing production plan. What are the needs of your community? It's not always just 10%.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, that's the way we are in Northampton. We're above our 10%. We're close to 12%, but it's not enough. And certainly our changes are about creating housing at all levels. And so it's not necessarily focused on just trying to get that sort of more subsidized affordable housing, but there are also needs right above that at 90, 100, 120% of area median income. And that's really important too for our community, but it's about meeting our overall housing goals.
I love that. Jean, I know you want to jump in.
I just want to make a plug again for mixed use. So we love the idea of mixing it up and having everything all combined. And that's really what made it, I think, a winner for us in Reading. I'll stop there. Thanks.
And you're a winner too, Jean, so thanks. I think I'll turn it over to Karina. I can talk to all of y'all all day long, but I think we're coming close to our program's end. Thank you all so much for the work that you are leading. And thank you everyone for tuning in and being so engaged throughout the chat and listening to this conversation. Karina, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Bea. I just want to say thank you so much to all of our speakers, to Bea, Kristen, Jean, Alex, Eric Hove, Mark Rassica, Eric Shupin, Laura Schufelt, Christian Brandt, Mark Jason, and of course, Speaker Keneally. And thank you to all of you for spending your afternoon with us. We will follow up with the video and other materials, more information on housing choice as we get it. Please keep an eye out for further information on our next housing choice webinar, which will be in June. It's called Getting to Yes, Zoning Under Housing Choice. And that will focus a bit more on strategizing for successful simple majority votes on these zoning changes and any updates that we have by then on housing choice. We'll hear about zoning initiatives that are currently underway or gearing up to get underway and how communities are approaching those. So I think that is it. Thank you all again. It was great to see your faces and hope to see you again in June. Have a good afternoon.